Ladies and gentlemen, educators and leaders, welcome to Leader Chat. I am Jeff Rose, and I'm excited for a couple of reasons for this discussion. Of course, the content and our guests that I'm going to introduce you to any moment, and that is one very specific reason. The other is that I love this. I love doing these Leader Chats, and I'll tell you why. All of us in our work, in our jobs, we have these things that are exciting and these things that are sometimes hard and challenging and laborious. But this Leader Chat process for me is always refreshing because I have the opportunity, of course, to learn. I can go and do my nerd out process of reading and researching and highlighting and underlining and making notes. And for some reason, I like that. Not everyone does. But then more importantly, I get to do what I appreciate even more, and that is talk. I get to ask questions of these experts that we invite in. And every single time, I find myself just learning so much with the hope and the prayer that this learning translates to yours. We do get feedback that it does, so we're thankful for that. And this just happens to be something that is energizing for me, this whole process. And it won't be any different today. I want to remind our observers, so whether you're watching us on video or you're listening to this podcast, if you're listening to the podcast, we constantly are trying to do a better job of reminding you to follow and subscribe. Comments are great. Giving us ratings are great. It gives us feedback. We read everything that we get. And so let us know how you're feeling. But those are important to the podcast world. And I think we spent the first 90-something episodes not even mentioning that. We just did our Leader Chats, and now we're trying to be a little bit more pushy and forward as it relates to asking for your help and support. Okay, so today we're going to be talking with Erin Jones, and Erin Jones is the author of Bridges to Heal: Stories and Strategies for Racial Healing. And this is how I got to know Erin. I have a colleague that said, I think there's somebody you should look into. And so once again, I kind of started the process. I watched these TED Talks, which I'll talk about here in a minute. And sure enough, I thought, oh, for sure. Not only does Erin live in the Northwest, which is, a place I spent over 20 years in, but her content and her passion and her story is amazing, and you're going to hear all about it. So here's a very shortened bio, and the reason I have to shorten this bio is because her story is actually part of our discussion, and you don't want to hear me tell it. It would be much more powerful and resonate more hearing it from her. Erin has worked as an athletic coach, a substitute teacher, a classroom teacher, an instructional coach, a state assistant superintendent, and a school district executive. Erin has earned awards as the most innovative world language teacher, the Washington State Milken Educator of the Year, White House Champion of Change, and the inaugural Hanford Education Leader. Since 2017, Erin has spoken to over 500,000 students and provided trainings and keynotes to a similar number of adults. She has 3 TEDx talks, which are based upon a recommendation for me as it relates to preparing for this. I recommend you go watch these TEDx talks. I, once again, shortened her bio, and today we're talking about strategies for and discussions of racial healing, once again, with Erin Jones. Let me invite Erin to the screen. From the Northwest to the Southeast, it's great to see you, Erin. How you doing?
I'm glad to be here. So glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
And so you've been introduced many, many times, and maybe I gave you the shortest bio. You know what it's like sometimes when you hear other people read your bio, right? It's kind of sometimes awkward. But in this case, like your story and, Bridges to Heal Us, you tell your story, which is very, very powerful. I thought I really need to shorten this because I kind of want you to tell it. Now, the dilemma is this. If I say, tell your story, well, we're going to be here a few hours, right? So, but you have to make sure that our audience, our listeners and watchers, know some of the key elements of your childhood and what got you to do what was the narrative or the arc for what you're doing today, and then of course what maybe continues to inspire you and your personal why. So take the floor and tell us about yourself. And this is going to be hard because you're kind of a Renaissance woman, and your past kind of leads you in that direction. It's truly unique.
Yeah, it's hard to know. I'm going to start from the very beginning. So I was born out of the body of a white woman. So I know this hair is it doesn't say Norwegian, but my mother is a Norwegian woman, my biological mother, and she actually had an affair with a black man in 1970, and he gave her an ultimatum and said either me or her, and she chose him, and she left me in the hospital, and I started my life in foster care. And I was really fortunate and was adopted by two Scandinavian Americans from northern Minnesota right away at 3 months old. So all I know is mom and dad. I don't call them my adopted parents. I call them mom and dad. Bruce and Dorothy Adamson, who were educators, they decided in 1976 to take their teaching degrees and go overseas. And so I had the incredible gift of going to the American School of The Hague in The Hague, the Netherlands. It is at the time, it was about a mile away from the United Nations World Court. So all of the children whose parents worked for the State Department, for embassies that were not connected to the British government, we had children there from literally all over the world, from Central America, South America, all across the continent of Africa, although many of the African students went to the British school because of their connections to English, that kind of English and that kind of an education. We had children from all across Asia in my school, Philippines, Thailand, Japan. It was an incredible experience to go from an orphanage basically from foster care to walking alongside children whose parents were really powerful people. And that exposure to difference was normalized for me. So whether that was difference in how people looked or difference in how people spoke, I was pretty fluent in Dutch by the time I was 6 or 7 years old. I was picking up French at 12. I was pretty fluent by the time I was 13 years old. I had traveled to 10 countries by the time I was 15 as an athlete. So I'm also a triple sport athlete. Well, I was. I'm not anymore. I'm in my 50s now. I just run just one direction now. But I was a soccer, basketball, and softball player at a pretty high level in Europe. And through sports, I got to travel to other countries. And so I was exposed to lots of difference, and difference was a good thing. It was seen as an asset. And learning languages was really important to me because I think I realized as a little girl, I wanted to be able to communicate, and I didn't want to make everyone speak my language. I wanted to make sure that I learned the cultures and languages of the people in whose countries I would visit. And so that was always really important to me. There are two encounters that really shaped who I am today outside of my parents. So my parents have definitely shaped me more than anyone else. They're the most incredible educators and people you'll ever meet. Also the most humble, quiet people. So you would never know they were in the room today, but they're amazing humans. But the other two experiences that shaped me were in the fourth grade. My best friend was the Israeli ambassador's daughter. And I learned that year as a fourth grader that the Palestinian Liberation Organization ambassador's son was also in our school. And so for Americans who think that the conflict between Israel and Palestine is new, I got to bear witness to that conflict as a child in 1980 and 1981 as I watched my classmates have to navigate in school while a war was happening in their homelands. And I began to teach myself Hebrew and Arabic as a fourth grader with a passion to bring peace to the Middle East. Those two friends ended up moving on to other places with their own state departments. And I lost my Arabic and Hebrew, but I never lost a passion to serve others. And when I was in 10th grade, I would learn about this man, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I was asked to do the very first speech at an assembly, our very first assembly in 1986, the year that Dr. King's birthday became a national holiday. Because I went to an American school, even though it was in Europe, we still celebrated Dr. King's birthday. And I got to give a speech about him. And in the process of writing that speech, I learned about his life, and I knew that I wanted to live a life like him. I wanted to invest in my education like he had. I wanted to have a dream that was bigger than me. It was bigger than me being famous or me being accomplished. It was about using all the skills and talents and experiences to make the world better. And his life really inspired me. And I came back to the United States as an 18-year-old for college with the intention to become a lawyer and go back to the UN, but realized at 18 in Philadelphia that, wow, we in this country educate children differently based on zip code, skin color, home language, disability. And I knew that was not what I had experienced growing up. And I knew that I had been born in this body and adopted by the parents I was adopted by and educated in an incredible school to give back. And I was very sure by the time I was 19, I was not going back to Europe. I was going to stay in America. And I thought I was just going to teach children who looked like me and give them what I had received. But I have now taught across the United States from Philadelphia to South Bend, Indiana. I was actually Pete Buttigieg's PE teacher when he was in the eighth grade. And I knew from that experience at his private school that I didn't want to teach private school. So I taught public school from there, Columbus, Ohio, and then Tacoma, Washington, Spokane. And I've invested now 35 years working in and around schools. And my passion and purpose in life is how can we help educators become the best version of themselves? And that means classroom teachers, paraeducators, administrators, so that they can help our children become the best version of themselves.
You know, it's interesting. Your story, you did a great job kind of summing it up because, the book goes into a little bit more detail, understandably. But, you went obviously from, being adopted and then Minnesota and then the Netherlands and then back to the US. And then you just experienced these really extreme differences as it relates to culture and how that impacts how we school and educate children. And in the meantime, you almost talk about how you're exploring and coming into your own as it relates to your own identity based upon being in different places in these different environments. So I guess I'm curious, as you kind of live out your why, and you've gone through this process of kind of your own racial identity, how do you have this conversation with people that have not had the kind of experience and exposure that you were just lucky and almost blessed to experience?
So I think if I could change anything about how we support educators and develop educators, support administrators in particular, I think one of the failings of teacher education and administrator prep is that we don't talk about identity. We don't help people navigate who are you? And so I never had the chance to just be. I always had to think about myself in contrast to something else, whether that was myself versus the Dutch people, myself versus the kids at my school who were all from different countries, myself versus the French when I was in France, myself versus the white people at my college. I never had the opportunity to just be. I always had to be in contrast to something else. And so the gift was that helped me really figure out who is Erin? What is uniquely Erin? And because I have done that work, it has also helped me help students think about who are you? And how have all of your life experiences and your identity shaped you? And what I realized doing that for 15 years with children and then jumping into administration is, wow, we don't help adults navigate their identities. And so most adults have just moved through the world as whoever they are, but they can't even tell you really who they are and how their childhood home shaped them, how their childhood community shaped them, how the relationships around them shaped them. We are all shaped by our communities, by our families, by the circumstances we experience. And I think for far too many educators, they have not ever been asked to think about their own identities. And then we want them to appreciate and value other people's identities, the identities of the children who come into their classrooms. And one of the things I firmly believe after 35 years of living in the US, I don't think you can appreciate other people if you don't really understand yourself. I think you tolerate other people. And I think this is often what happens in school spaces is that educators are tolerating children who come from really different lived experiences, not because they don't like them, but because they actually don't even know themselves. And so my invitation now to leaders is to do their own self-work. And that's part of the reason for the book is sharing my own story, being vulnerable, and then inviting leaders and classroom teachers, you're a leader too. You may not have a title leader, but you're leading children to think about what are the identities that I carry into the school space with me every day that have shaped how I think about what's good and what's bad, how I think about what is acceptable and not, how I think about what is expert and not. All of our life experiences have brought us to this point, and I think we don't take enough time to think about those life experiences.
You mentioned, Erin, in the book, there's this part where you describe coming back to the U.S. for college, and I underlined this and I pulled it, and this is kind of a direct quote. You mentioned as you are kind of amidst this starting college, there's this one line based upon this story, and I won't tell the story, but I did not even know what it meant to be Black at this point. Right. So I thought maybe you can tell us more about that.
Yeah. You know, race is a social construct. So when I do training, I tell people we created this dynamic of race. Well, not the United States alone. So in fact, the idea of skin color being a factor really started in the 1600s and the Catholic Church thinking about who could they go and colonize, who could the Crusades, where should they go? And there was really these notions, they didn't call it black or brown, but the inklings of this conversation about skin color started with who are the good people, the good Christian people, and who are the bad people that we need to go convert. And there was a skin dynamic there. But in this country, skin color and the stories that we talk about, I define race as a social construct that was created to attach skin color to stories that we tell about a people. And I tell people that other countries have stories about race. South Africa definitely has stories about race, as does France because of colonization. So we all have stories that we tell about race. So most Western countries have stories they tell about race, but it's not biologic. There's nothing about biology that like race and biology are not the same thing. The stories that we tell about skin color in the United States are unique because of the way that the United States was founded, because of the story, the origin story of the United States. Living in Europe, even though there are stories of race, because slavery didn't happen there, because there were not large communities of brown folks, especially in the 70s, who lived in the Netherlands, I got to just be Erin. And what was unique about me in Europe was that I was American. Well, that washed away once I became fluent in Dutch and French. I could just be Dutch or French. I learned to be a chameleon and just show up and blend in. That was my goal. And then I came to the United States, and suddenly the first thing people saw was not Erin. It was Black and then girl. Gender was much more important too. And I didn't know what it meant to be Black in America because I hadn't come up around those stories of race. Now, I will say my white parents and my English teacher in high school made sure that I had read all the books about Black history in America. So I understood um, everything from slavery through Reconstruction, Jim Crow, the Civil Rights Movement. I had read Alice Walker and James Baldwin and Richard Wright and Zora Neale Hurston. I'd read all the books. In fact, my mother read all the books with me. So I knew about Black people in America. I still didn't know what it meant to be Black in America, though, because inhabiting that identity wasn't something that I got to practice in my own body. I got to read about it. And I really thought that by the 80s, we were in a different place. And I would have just a horrible realization as a freshman that we were not as far ahead as I thought we were. And there were constant reminders during my 4 years of college that I was less than because of my skin color, that there were lower expectations for me, that I was expected to score lots of points on the basketball court or the soccer field and not really expected to do well in college. And those dynamics really helped me come into an understanding of the reality that I was going to need to move differently in America, but I was also going to become a teacher and inspire young people who looked like me to believe you can do anything you want and don't allow the stories that are told about race here to define who you are.
Erin, as I've watched you on video, and you and I have talked preparing for this conversation, and have read your book, it got me thinking a little bit. In that, clearly, you are promoting and pursuing this concept of, once again, people exploring their identity, race, and the ability to talk and have discourse around those things, and it got me curious because, I'm an educator. I work for an educational organization that is politically agnostic, and that is actually often very, very refreshing. However, watching what is occurring, throughout our country as it relates to just the political polarization and the way that's landing in the laps of educators and educational leaders, and almost like our inability to have this civil conversation around race and identity is at times, hard and frustrating. And I guess I have this hope and this image that if only we could talk about race and actually not be hijacked based upon right or left or anything in between.
Yeah.
If only we could. And I don't know if exactly how and if that is possible. However, in your book, you explore these themes, humility, humanity, and history. And that was helpful for me. And so I'm wondering if you can maybe kind of walk through kind of what you meant by those themes.
Yeah, sure. I think I want to go back to something that you shared around hijacked. I think so often these conversations are hijacked because they're uncomfortable. And I think, especially as an athlete, discomfort is what grows my muscles. Discomfort is what makes me faster. So I have spent a lifetime. I started competitive sports when I was 3 and I'm 53. So I've been a competitive athlete for 50 years. I am used to people telling me, you got to stretch here, you got to push here, and embracing that as an opportunity. I think most humans are not, though. They don't like discomfort. And I think too often conversations about race and gender have been deemed inappropriate, they've been politicized. And the reality is they just are. Like, we just have stories that we've told in this country for hundreds of years around skin color and gender and religion. And I believe the only way to move forward is for us to be honest and have conversation. And I think we need to do that with humility. So here's why humility for me. I think, number one, I have to have the humility that when I walk into spaces with people who are maybe having this conversation for the first time, I don't use shame. I don't employ shame as a strategy. I show up as also a learner. So I have not arrived. I am always a learner. And I think that's part of being an educator by trade is I think I need to always be a learner. And so part of humility is realizing I have not yet arrived. I am still learning about myself and other people. I can only know so much. And so we're in this together. And so it's having the humility that I can't do this by myself. And I need to show up with the humility to listen to your story as well. Humanity for me is really important because I think we've dehumanized so many people. We have made people less than, again, whether that's about their race or even how they vote. I think even we have dehumanized people, whether it's Democrats dehumanizing Republicans or Republicans dehumanizing Democrats. We've done a lot of dehumanizing of people in this country that is not ever helpful. And so one of the things that I share, and I just finished a 2-hour training this morning with the state of Washington, my most important goal is that we learn to humanize one another, that we realize above all of our identities, we're all human first. And if we can just show up and recognize that we actually need each one of us in our spaces to be the best version of us, like capital US. We need each one of us, and we need all the identities that we carry, but we have to be willing to see the person next to us, even and especially if they vote different, if they look different, if they live in a different community. We have to see them as valuable to the world too. And then history. I think history for me represents both a willingness to tell my own story, my own history, but also to acknowledge the history of this country. And I know that there are lots of Americans who think to be a true patriot means that we only share about the good things in our country. I grew up in a Europe post World War II. And one of the things that I really appreciate about Germany is if you are a student in Germany today, every student will learn about the atrocities of World War II. And not in a shamey way, but just a way to say, this is our truth. We actually did this. We actually did this. And one of the things I find about this version of the United States is there is an unwillingness to face the truth of our history. As someone who's been married for 31 years, here's what I know about my husband and I. We were only able to stay married for 31 years because we have had to be honest about even our origin story and the places where we have failed one another. Whether that's failing one another in not talking about something I purchased, or failing one another by bad talking my partner to someone. The only way that we made it this far is we are willing to have conversations about the tough things and willing to own when we've failed and we've made a mistake. I would invite this country to the same conversation about its own history. The reality is, I think there are many folks on the conservative side that would want us to just talk about the good things in our history and would also suggest that anyone who wants to talk about equity or social justice only wants to talk about the bad things. And I would say that as a mom and as an American, I think telling our story is the good, the bad, and the ugly. It's all of it. It's not being selective about the stories that we tell. It's saying that we are who we are in this moment because of all the things, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And there are so many beautiful things that we don't tell the stories about either in this country. And so history is a willingness to really have conversations about all the truths that make the US the US. And I think we're also unwilling to do that right now. And I want to constantly invite people into those conversations.
You do promote this concept of being authentic and being vulnerable. So let me tell you something about myself. And I'm going to say this, and everyone who has ever worked with or for me is going to have this eye roll and a no duh moment. But let me be very, very clear. I really, really struggle as it relates to patience. And it's out of passion. I do want to see improvements and great things happen quickly. And I have always struggled as a leader. This is a blind spot of mine as it relates to taking the time needed for people to process, for people to actually engage in, discourse that takes time. I want to have the conversation, then I want to move. Right? I want to think about the strategy. What's the right maneuver, and then I want to codify it. Right? And I want to make sure it's in language. And I want to make sure our policies are aligned. And one thing that you do in the book is say, no, that's not where you have to be careful not to move too fast. We need organizations, systems to take the time before they put out a statement. This is our mission statement. This is our policy, to take time to actually lean in and focus on their own identity and just create this conversation. Can you talk about that? Because obviously that was convicting to me because of my blind spot. But I think that sometimes that does happen, even based upon pure intent. Like there are a lot of leaders who want to do the right thing, but they also sometimes were pushed to do things quickly, and we're all accountable for improvements and data. So talk to us about pacing.
So I'll give you a real life example. My husband was a pastor for a long time, and then he became a teacher. And then while he was a teacher, he also was an elder in our church. And we went through a big transition. And our senior pastor wanted to step down and do something different. And my husband, as the head elder, had to help the church transition to a new way. And so I sat in meetings with him and the other elders for weeks, for weeks, for weeks. And then I remember in January at the all church meeting, he was asked to make announcements about the changes that were going to happen. And the people in the room, most of them not elders, the elders were there, but also just the regular folks in the church, a lot of them were really upset. And they felt like decisions had been made quickly and they weren't well thought out. And I knew from being behind the scenes that they'd spent weeks and weeks and weeks meeting with lots of different people. But what I also realized, having led in school spaces, is oftentimes what happens is a leader will meet with other leaders in a school space and make a decision they think is best for the school, but the staff haven't been part of those conversations. And so even though this may be what's best for the school, and you've had dozens of hours of conversation about this change that you know needs to happen, if the rest of your staff hasn't been brought along as you're having those conversations, what can happen is, even though you've had lots of conversations, the people who have to actually do the work aren't with you, right? And so we have to figure out better ways of bringing people along with us. I think the other thing that I realized as a mom of 3 children, they're all adults now, but they're all really different learners. So I have my youngest son is on the autism spectrum, but he also has a photographic memory. So he can read something one time and he will remember it. In fact, I learned when he was little, don't promise him anything, because he will tell you the day that you promised him and the time that you promised him. So I just didn't tell him. I would say, I'm going to think about that, so I'll get back to you. So he right away could get something. My daughter needed time to process. My oldest son just didn't care. Just didn't care. So anything we did, he was good. But my daughter always needed more time to process. And it wasn't because she was dumb. She just needed more time to process. And what that helped me do as a classroom teacher and then as an administrator is to realize, man, if my 3 kids in my own house have these 3 really different ways of processing information, when I have a staff of 80 or 120, it is no different. Some of them are going to get it right away and they're going to be on board right away and they're going to understand why you made the decision. Others won't care. They're just going to do their thing anyway. And then there's going to be a subset that are going to need time. And we have to be willing to give people time, because we could do the right thing, but not have prepared people. And it ends up blowing up in our face, even though it's the right thing. And I think the last thing I'll say, and this is very American, Americans love to do things quickly. That is part of the culture. And that's part of, again, understanding your own story. American culture loves to do things quickly, but what happens is we leave people behind who are not quick. And this kind of ironic that I'd be having this conversation, because I was always a fast learner. I was always a fast runner. I could pick up any new skill on the basketball court, or now I'm running. I'm the fastest one in my gym. Didn't take me long to get there. I'm invested. But what I have learned is not everybody is that way. And that doesn't make me better than anybody else. It just makes me different. And so part of my running journey has been, man, I sucked at first. For the first 3 months that I was part of Orange Theory, I hated it, hated it, hated it. I was so slow. There's a whole different thing running with a basketball than running on a treadmill. And I absolutely hated it. And I felt like I sucked. And then after 3 months, it was like, okay, I don't like it, but I'm getting to a place where I can tolerate it. Now, running is the best thing. And I am known in my gym as the runner. Everybody knows me as the runner. I am constantly thinking about that now as I think about leading and as I think about bringing other people along. Have I given people that time to just suck at a thing? Have I given people time to just tolerate a thing while they're learning? And then am I celebrating them once they get it? Or just assuming, oh, you should have gotten there. That's where I was expecting. I think we don't do enough of those 3 things.
I asked the question not because I was, requesting this, but you did an incredible job just convicting me, and making, and as you're talking, I'm spinning over kind of this history of mine, and I have, like all of us, made incredible mistakes. I'm really good at that. Fortunately, I can learn from those. But there's always this thread, right? This kind of thread of truth as it relates to me, and there's a reason and there's a why behind that, and how I am wired the way I am wired, and some of it's conditioned, and some of it just probably just is innate to a degree. But your points are really, really solid, Erin. That I think it's very important that we understand that we're serving other people. And by serving other people, we also need to be aligned and very empathetic, specific to their needs as learners and communicators, etc., as opposed to, I'm taking you here, follow me. It's going to be wonderful. It's going to be great. Here we go. And we're going to go fast. That often does not work. And it's often is what has tripped me up over and over and over again. So once again, thank you for the reminder on trying to slow me down, and that wasn't even your intent, but well done. Okay, and this sets me up for this next question, but before we do that, I'm reminded I have to send this back to Chris. Chris has some words for us. So Chris, you're up.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Richard, and I'm the producer of the Leader Chat with Jeff Rose podcast, brought to you by Cognia. Just a quick reminder, if you haven't done so already, please make sure you follow or subscribe to us if you're listening to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, or Podbean, to make sure you're getting all the latest updates on the newest episodes. You can also check out our video episodes under our Cognia YouTube channel. Please make sure you check those out and leave us a like or a comment and let us know how we're doing. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. Back to you, Jeff.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. So, okay, this is something I wrote down when you and I were talking, preparing for this. I was taking notes, and you said this: curiosity is a form of courage. And of course, I thought, as when you told me that, I thought, oh, I really, really agree with this. Yes, I'm writing this down. Curiosity. And then I started thinking, oh, wait a minute. I agree with her, but what did she mean by that? So that was, look, I'm being patient here. So as opposed to just taking your words and agreeing with them, I want to delve into that, because I think that was powerful for me. What do you mean by curiosity as a form of courage?
So I think too often we make judgments about people based on what they say or how they vote or where they live, and we don't get to know who they are. So I'll give you a really practical example. And those in the Pacific Northwest will really appreciate this, but I'll give you some background. First of all, as a leader, I don't believe in asking other people to do what I'm not doing. It's really important to me that I model what I'm asking people. So I tell people that curiosity is just part of my practice. And I was invited to speak at an event in Idaho about a year and a half ago. And if you've never been to the Pacific Northwest, they're not allowed of this in Idaho. And in fact, there's been some anti-this in Idaho. And so one of the things I've learned is when I go to Idaho, I fly into Spokane, Washington. It's about a 30-minute drive. I always have someone pick me up. And it's not about fear, it's about wisdom. I'm a 6-foot tall Black lady with a big afro. If my car breaks down, I'm not trying to break down in Idaho. So someone always picks me up, and this woman picks me up, and we're driving and talking, and she's in her 70s. She grew up in Seattle and just moved to Idaho to retire with her husband. And I'm going to be speaking at her women's event that night, and I think it's at the Coeur d'Alene resort, which I had been to many times. And so we're driving and talking and driving and talking, and we get off the freeway, and I used to live in Spokane, so I know the area pretty well. And we turn left, and the Coeur d'Alene resort is to the right. And I am now wondering, where are we going? She said we're going to the resort. And we turn left, and we're driving and talking, and we suddenly pass a sign that says Hayden Lake. Now, if you are not from the Pacific Northwest, you may not know what Hayden Lake is, but it was ground zero for a white supremacist organization. Back in 1986, they were taken over by the FBI. I mean, it was bad. They had caches of weapons, and it was a neo-Nazi group. And I know that about it because I have a current friend who was raised there and escaped when he was in high school. So I know a lot about that area. And we are passing the sign to Hayden Lake, Idaho. And I turned to the woman in the car and I said, where are you taking us right now? We just passed Hayden Lake, Idaho sign. I thought we were at the resort. She said, we are at the resort. And I said, but the resort is back that way. She said, no, we're at the Hayden Lake Resort. And I said, ma'am, did you see who you have in the car with you? And suddenly her face went gray. And she realized, and she slowed down the car and she said, oh my gosh, Erin, I had not thought what it would be like for a Black person to be in Hayden Lake. I had not even thought about it. You know what? I am so sorry. I live at Hayden Lake Resort. We have a free room for you, but I'm going to take you back to the Coeur d'Alene Resort because I had not even thought about what this would feel like. And I stopped her and I said, you know what? I'm about to speak to a group of white women tonight about racial healing. How dare I ask them to be curious about me if I'm not willing to be curious here? I'm going to stay at the resort tonight. Now, I'm not going to be running in the morning at 6:00 in the morning in Hayden Lake, Idaho, because that would not be wise. But I am going to stay at the resort. And do you know that evening when I shared that story, people were brought to tears because they realized I'm not asking you to be curious about me in ways that I'm not willing to be curious about you. I shared with them at that evening event. I show up here with the curiosity that I don't assume that because you live in Idaho, and definitely not in Coeur d'Alene, that you have to be a racist. I come here with the curiosity that you all have your own stories. And I'm going to assume that you all showed up tonight because you want to be curious about me. And we ended up having the most powerful conversation that night. And it was a room filled with white women. And it was beautiful. And I know that because I modeled curiosity myself, they matched me. And so curiosity for me is not assuming that every Republican voted that way because of X, Y, or Z. It's not assuming that every Democrat voted the way they did because of X, Y, or Z. It's not assuming that somebody who shows up in my classroom speaking Spanish cannot also speak English. It's choosing to not make assumptions about people. And when people say things that may appear offensive, having the posture of curiosity that says to them, hey, here's how what you said felt there. Is that really what you meant? And I think that kind of curiosity is courageous.
So when you have these chapters in the book, one is around kind of your personal story, and then one is understanding other, right? Understanding other. Can you briefly just expand on that a little bit? I think it's probably self-explanatory to some, but not necessarily. So just touch base on that.
I think we can't move well in school spaces. Are the only spaces where everybody's there. Like, you can't take yourself out of the space. Like, we go to school. If you're a firefighter, you can just do your firefighter thing. If you're an engineer, you can do your engineer thing. When we show up in schools, we show up with people from every lived experience. And you may be in a homogeneous school space, but there are still many cultures in any school because of socioeconomics, because of regions, because of neighborhoods. And so part of my work around equity is I first need to start with me. I need to understand, how am I showing up in this school space? How am I showing up in my classroom? How am I showing up as a leader? And then, now that I know me a little bit better, who are the people that are in my space? And especially, who are the people that I don't know well? Who are the people with really different lived experiences, identities from mine? And how can I do a better job of learning their stories? And that requires getting curious. And for those of you, especially who are leaders, it means if you're a white person showing up at the NAACP meetings and just showing up without any agenda, just showing up to meet. If you have a community of immigrants, showing up at their community centers and just attending events and watching and listening and paying attention to how do the genders interact? How do different age groups, how do different generations interact? What's the noise level in that space? Who are the communities that you don't know well just because you've been surrounded by people like you your whole life? And I think a lot of administrators I meet, not everyone, but a lot have been in homogeneous spaces for a lot of their career and their lived experience. And so all they know is what they've been around. And my invitation to you is figure out who are those groups in your school that you need to better understand, go to where they are. Don't make them come to you. You go to where they are and just pay attention and just listen, and maybe even pay for one of their leaders to go out to coffee once a month with you and just listen to their story and share your own.
When you and I were also talking, preparing for this conversation, we discussed community and belonging, right? And you're starting to really, touch on those pieces. And so from an educational leadership perspective, so talking to leaders and your earlier point around teachers being leaders, fully agree. And there are leaders who are tasked with leading, right? Whether you're a principal or anything in between up to a superintendent, whatever that may be. So from an educational leadership perspective, what does it mean for our schools from your perspective when we start thinking about promoting community and belonging?
So I talk about inclusion and belonging in the work that I do. And I was just in a school last week where I had, they've been having some altercations between students of color and white students, between the LGBTQIA students and white Christian students. There's been a lot of negative interactions. And so I came into the school and I sat with the students of color first, and then I sat with the LGBTQIA students. And then they came in and we all sat together with the leadership students, and I had them answer these two questions in small groups, and I mixed them up. So they had a mix of students from all three groups in each of the 10 groups I facilitated. And they had to answer, what is inclusion and what is belonging? And I defined inclusion as the practices and policies that we establish hoping for belonging, hoping to create spaces where people feel like they can be their full selves. But belonging is when people actually feel like I can show up and be fully me. I can show up and me is enough. I can show up and people see me as me. They treat me as a unique individual. And that is really hard. It's really hard to do in schools. And what it requires for leaders is you have to first model that with your leadership team and then your staff. I see way too many leaders trying to jump to kid work before they've done that work with their staff. If your staff members don't feel like they belong fully, guess what they show to their students? It all runs downhill. So we have to start at the very top. And I would invite any superintendents to think about, how are you supporting all of your school administrators to make sure that they all feel like they belong and are valued, that you value all the identities that they carry, that you value their unique differences, whether, again, that's gender or sexual orientation or language. You may have an administrator that is able to translate and speak multiple languages. Are you seeing that? Are you valuing that? And not in a tokenizing way, but thinking about how can we make sure that we're acknowledging the beauty of our differences, and thinking about, if you have a school district that has diverse regions, have you thought intentionally about who's leading in each region? Do you have people leading in those spaces that look like, understand the community that they're leading? And so as a superintendent, thinking about, who am I placing in leadership and how am I supporting them? And then for principals, then thinking about, how am I making sure that I'm seeing all of my staff? Because what I find is, when the superintendent is doing that for their administrators, and then their administrators are doing that for their staff, then you will also see in classrooms a different level of belonging in classrooms. But I think we don't talk enough about modeling and the power of modeling that. And every person should be able to show up as their full self. One of the messages I share often with leaders is, I can't be my best self if I can't show up as my full self.
Yeah, well said. Well said. Hey, this next question, it's traditional for us. We ask all of our guests and experts this. So I'm preparing you, because it's a hard one. Put it this way, it'd be hard for me, because I could talk to you for hours and hours and hours. And what I find is that this is the one content piece that we have in the leadership circle, is these leader chats. But we also really believe in our model, right? Our slogan is, circles are better than rows. This concept of iron sharpening iron, leaders helping other leaders, with sometimes problems in practice where there is a community and a space for people to be open and honest and transparent and actually give help and get it. Mm-hmm. In the meantime, here we are with this content that we're pushing out to leaders. So if you were to imagine, we are around a table, and with us are principals, superintendents, and everything in between. These are educational leaders. We've had this discussion that we just had, you and I, but with them, and our time is up. But you have the mic. And so you're going to end with kind of your drop the mic moment. This is my last thing I want you to think about. And I want you to give very clear, firm recommendation, what you expect or hope from them as leaders. And I want you to do it in less than 30 seconds, right? Which is, by the way, really, really hard. But you're up for it. You're incredibly articulate. You'll be great. Ready, go.
Okay. Number one, most important thing, know your why. And I asked this question, why do you do what you do, where you do it? Because in the education space, I think we can be really clear about our why, but not doing the right what, and maybe not in the right where. So be really clear about that. Second thing, practice great self-care. And that means spirit, mind, and body every day, because you as a leader right now, this is the hardest season to be a leader. If you are not pouring into yourself and investing in you, you cannot pour out to others. Last thing, start with better knowing yourself. You can't help your staff. You can't help your students if you don't know who you are and how you're moving through the world.
If you haven't listened or followed our show, Leader Chat, Erin, you have to go listen to some episodes, because you have no idea how your message resonates as it relates to other things we have been exploring specific to leaders. I mean, your 1, 2, and 3, pristine. And I, of course, want to thank you for, right? I, of course, want to thank you for, we just had this summit last week here, and I was in this conversation, and it was a roundtable discussion, and all of a sudden I hear these snaps, and I look over and this man's snapping away, right? And I thought, what's going on there? He's snapping. And then over and over and over, he keeps snapping. And then eventually, throughout the room, he didn't have to say a word. Everyone's snapping. So they're talking amongst each other, and all of a sudden these snaps all over the place, and here you are bringing me right back to last week. Well done. And you know what's interesting about your book and your message, right? People, not everyone can see this, but I'll even hold it up. But us, right? When you talk about bridges to heal us, it's capitalized, right? Your focus on us is very intentional. And I think that you describe that so clearly. I just want to make sure that you know that before we part ways here. I'm so thankful that, number one, we were connected, and you were, just willing to spend this time with me and us today. Thank you so much, Erin.
Thank you so much. I feel honored to be here.
Oh, great. Be well. Ladies and gentlemen, it was interesting, this conversation with Erin, as you've listened or watched, you notice that she manages to sometimes bring up some difficult conversation, but with these kind of two things, this humility and grace is what I wrote down as she was talking to me just now. Humility and grace. I'm so thankful for this opportunity to kind of pick her brain and, more specifically, ask for advice from a leadership perspective that she was able to give us so clearly. And so, ladies and gentlemen, educators, leaders, I happen to know that you've appreciated this conversation just as much as I have. Be well.